Up next, Gordon and I take a look at the Sony A7r Mark III on the Camera Labs Photography Podcast. Hi, it's Doug Kay. I'm here with Mr. Camera Labs, Gordon Lang. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, Doug. How are you?
Good, thanks. We're taking a look here at the Sony A7r Mark III. We've come a long way with the A7 line.
We have, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. Doug has actually got the camera with him. He's been shooting with it. I've been shooting with it on multiple occasions. I've already written my full review at cameralabs.com if you want to go and see an insane amount of detail there. So I think Doug and I feel pretty familiar and fairly well qualified to talk about this camera. So this is our in-depth video. If you're after a quicker overview, I also have a quicker overview video, the first looks one if you just want the highlights. This is for the people who really want to know exactly what this camera can and can't do.
This is the real thing. And I've been, actually, this is good because I've been shooting with it as recently as a few hours ago. So I am up to date on the A7r Mark III, but I've also had with me an A7r Mark II and my trusty new Alpha 9. So I shot with all three cameras and went back and forth for a couple of weeks.
Okay, so as a quick overview of this camera, it's a full-frame mirrorless camera with 42 megapixels, 4K video, shoots at 10 frames per second. It has built-in stabilization. So very much like, say, Nikon's D850, this is a real all-rounder. Only in the bad old days of only a couple of years ago, you had to choose between ultra-high resolution cameras and speedy cameras. If you wanted to shoot high-res, they were slow. If you wanted to shoot fast, then you had to put up with low resolutions. Now, Sony and Nikon, and this looks like the way that the industry is going, are giving you everything in one camera. The A7r Mark III can shoot very, very high-resolution images, but also shoot very, very quickly. It's a camera you could use for very considered landscapes and studio work at one moment, but also fairly respectable sports and wildlife at another. So it is an all-rounder. And how much are you looking at for spending on this camera, Doug?
Yeah, this camera is just under $3,200 here in the United States. Not inexpensive, hefty price.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Nikon D850, which is arguably, I mean, I know it's a DSLR, but it's arguably its kind of closest modern rival. How much is a D850 body?
Just $100 more, $3,300 here in the US.
Same ballpark. Obviously, the most similar camera to it is its predecessor, at least physically from the outside. The A7r Mark II, how much is that going for?
That's only $2,400. You can save $800, but we're going to talk about whether that's a worthwhile savings or not.
Definitely. And also, obviously, there's another DSLR company, Canon. Canon, that's it. The 5DS and the 5DSR. Do you happen to know how much those go for?
Yeah, the 5DS is $3,500, $300 more than this one. The 5DSR comes in $500 more than this camera. So they're going after the same markets. At least the 5DS.
$500 for an R. $500 for that letter R.
Yeah, well, no, you only pay $200 for the R.
It's the most expensive letter in the alphabet.
It is.
The difference, of course, between those models is that one has an anti-aliasing filter. That's the not R. And the R doesn't have the anti-aliasing filter, which should mean that you can get kind of crisper results, albeit with the risk. You always have to say the risk of moire. Terms and conditions apply. Although the D850 and the A7R Marks II and III do not have the low-pass anti-aliasing filter.
Low-pass filter is so last year. Everybody's walking away from them.
I know, even at 24 megapixels, it's not really an issue. So at 40 to 50 megapixels, it's definitely not an issue. It can usually resolve those fine details, or you can manage them. So let's dive straight in and have a look at the body. Now, Doug actually has one in front of him, so we'll have a look at his beautiful body and the A7r Mark III.
Not just mine, the camera too.
Did you see what I did there?
I did.
What
very,
lens
very
have you got
clever.
on that, Doug?
What's that?
What lens have you got?
This is the Sony 55mm f1.8. It's a Zeiss lens, one of the very first E-mount lenses that Sony came out with.
Yeah, that came out with the A7r Mark I and the A7 Mark I alongside the 35mm 2.8. They came out with two really small, lightweight prime lenses, and I still like them. They're very nice. So what you'll notice about the A7r Mark III is that it appears at first glance to share the same body as the A7r Mark II. And that may or may not come as a bit of a surprise. If you'd seen the Alpha A9 and you thought, I wonder if Sony's going to be using that body. I kind of wanted them to use the A9 body because the A9 body had a ton of enhancements that I wanted on the A7r Mark III. But what Sony's done is kind of they've done both those things. So they've kept essentially the same body as the A7R Mark II, but included a lot of the control and functionality enhancements of the A9. So we're going to, now there's so much to talk about. I'm not going to cover everything in this video. It's a long video, but we're not going to cover everything. So I'm just going to kind of talk about the highlights and hear what you want to think about this as well, Doug. Probably when you pick it up from the top, it looks pretty much the same as the Mark II, but when you turn it to the back, there are quite a few differences. First of all, there's an AF joystick, which is inherited from the A9, incredibly useful. I love that. You've got a larger, more tactile rear wheel, which just feels much better. You've got an AF on button, which allows you to separate autofocus and the shutter release. You've got a relocated movie button. That's in a far more sensible position than it was before. It's a nice squishy button. The viewfinder itself, now high resolution. It's the same magnification, but you now have a quad VGA viewfinder on that. That looks like the new standard on higher-end mirrorless cameras, and it delivers such a nice detailed view. And the screen, hurrah, is now touch sensitive. Did you find that it was a touch screen, Doug? Did you use that much?
Not once.
Moving on.
But I've been told it's touch sensitive.
Well, I'm going to show you a video right now. Here is a video of focus pulling using the touch screen. Now, I'm actually hand holding this. This is 4K, but we've downscaled it for presentation here. If you're listening to us on the podcast, let me describe what's happening. I'm tapping various parts of the screen to pull focus between the subject in the foreground and in the background. And thanks to the phase detection autofocus system built into the sensor, it works very, very smoothly and confidently. That's brilliant. I'm really, really pleased to see it. It's also got a touchpad functionality on it so that when you're composing through the viewfinder, you can use your thumb to actually touch the screen and move the AF area around if you don't want to use the AF joystick. They've covered all bases. But that's about where it ends. I want to see more touch functionality from Sony here. I mean, you can't touch through the large iconed function menu, even though it's crying out. It's got these big tappable buttons. You want to tap them, but nothing happens. You can't swipe through images and playback. So the hardware's there, but I think it needs an update in the software. Moving around the body, Doug, can you show us the ports? I want to see the USB port, because there isn't just one USB port. There are two USB ports. There's USB 2 and a USB-C port, two USB ports. The idea here is that you can actually charge or power this camera over one USB. That would be the USB 2, because power doesn't need speed. And then you use the other one for tethering. And this camera supports really high-speed tethering. It's very, very impressive, because that USB-C port supports USB 3.1 speeds. One of the other really cool things on the other side of the camera, something that I thought would not be possible on this body size, twin memory card slots. Now, Doug, did you have two memory cards loaded in this?
I did, yes.
And did you like the security of having two memory cards?
Especially when I was shooting in high burst mode and burning through cards quickly. That was the main time I used both slots. But only one of them is the high speed SD.
That's right. So only one. So you can put UHS Class 2 cards in both slots, but only one of them will exploit the speed of it. And that's a little bit of a downside, because I'm testing a lot of cameras these days that have got twin card slots, and some of them, costing quite a bit less than this camera, support UHS Class 2 speeds on both slots. So you really notice that. I noticed it in terms of a reduced buffer when you're shooting bursts, if you're using the second card slot. Also longer write times. So when you're waiting for that buffer to flush out, if you use the fast slot, if you use the slow slot, it does take longer, and you're looking at shorter bursts.
Yeah, the A9 has the same thing, and I really don't get that, because I don't know why I would want to have one fast card slot and one not so fast. Just doesn't make sense to me. I wish they both had fast slots.
And also, when you are shooting with a camera of this class, it's shooting 42 megapixel images, and it can shoot uncompressed RAW as well. These are very, very big files, and it's a high-end camera. Now, it's interesting that, when you look at Canon and Nikon, they look at other card formats that are faster. You've got CFast, you've got XQD, you've got, other formats that can really shift that data rate, really increase those data speeds. So you look at the mirrorless models like the A7r Mark III, and I appreciate there's no room for an XQD slot in there. That's one of the benefits of having a big, hefty DSLR. There's plenty of room for bigger cards, but equally, those bigger cameras, it's not really an issue. When you're shooting big bursts, say with a 1DX or a Nikon D5 or something like that, then it just clears that buffer so quickly on those bursts, thanks to those faster card formats. So that's something I feel Sony is coming up against, but it could at least fit 2 card slots, SD slots that were both UHS.
You know, it's funny because what I've defaulted to doing is putting 2 high-speed cards in the camera and simply using the second slot as a place to store my backup card. And if I fill the first card, I swap them into the other slot. I mean, that's really what it's become. It might as well be a dead slot for all that matters. Hey, I want to mention one thing about the body before we leave this subject. The base profile is the same as the A9. We'll talk about the battery in a few minutes, but the fact is that the Alpha Swiss plate that you buy for this, the L plate, let's say from Really Right Stuff or somebody else, the A9 plate fits this perfectly. And so that's interesting. So it's sort of a hybrid between the Mark II body and the A9 body.
It also uses the A9 battery grip as well, I believe.
Could be. That would make sense.
Now you've hinted on it, so let's move on to that big complaint about the Mark II series, which was battery life. I mean, the battery on the A7r Mark II and all of those previous Sony mirrorless cameras was not great. And they admitted that, it's a tiny battery. And the idea is that you just have to get used to carrying several batteries or topping it up over USB, in between shoots. But typically on the A7r Mark II, I was really, if I was doing a bit of Wi-Fi image transfer, a few seconds of movie shooting here and there, stabilization, I was lucky to get more than about 100 frames per charge. Now, when the A9 came out, they introduced this new Z-type battery that just transformed things. They say technically it's got just over 2 times the capacity, but in use, I find you're looking at way more than double the battery life, way more. I mean, on the A7r Mark III, I went through so many battery charges on it on multiple occasions, and each one I was getting way more than 500 shots per charge. And that, again, was very mixed use. And it was with the Bluetooth always actively tagging. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It was with mechanical shutter as well. If you shoot with the electronic shutter with bursts, shooting sports, I was finding I could easily get over 1,000 frames. Now, Doug, what's your experience with it battery-wise?
It's a night and day difference. With the older A7s, the small battery, I usually went out with 3 batteries, and I was glad because one of them I always forgot to charge anyway. The new Z or Z batteries, you call it, is just like you said, it's much more than double the capacity. I've never, in a full day of shooting, gotten through one of these batteries. And on the Alpha 9, I shot the Blue Angels, and I got over 5,000 exposures, admittedly all in rapid fire continuous mode, but over 5,000 shots. I had 37% left on this battery. This is a game changer in terms of battery life for this series of cameras. Big improvement.
Definitely, and it's really addressed, I think, one of the biggest issues people had with mirrorless, and particularly Sony mirrorless cameras. And it's something that all the mirrorless manufacturers are doing. They realize that it is a sticking point for people who are coming from DSLRs. Obviously, with electronic composition, full-time electronic composition, you're always going to have a higher battery drain because you're always driving a panel. But this really has changed things. And for me, shooting with the Mark III, battery no longer was an issue for me. And if you're interested in video, I found on the A7r Mark II that typically, in terms of the total amount of video you could shoot, the Mark III was shooting roughly what they would say capacity-wise, roughly twice as much video. But on the Mark II, I found that the camera actually started to overheat after 25 minutes worth. I couldn't even get to a half-hour clip without it overheating. But Doug, you did some tests with it, and you filmed consecutive 4K clips on the Mark III for 2.5 hours before the battery finally expired. I mean, that's a huge difference. Yeah,
2.5 hours. The battery died at about that point, and I had an infrared thermometer. I was measuring the body temperature. The hottest spot was right here on the camera, and it was about 10 degrees centigrade above ambient temperature, but it was never hot. It got slightly warm to the touch, but that was it. Never had any sense that I was close to some kind of thermal shutdown.
So all of these things, I mean, we're going to talk about the electronic and software features, later in the review, but the actual physical differences, for me, made a massive difference shooting with this camera compared to the Mark II. I'm going to talk briefly about the wireless on it now. I mean, it has Wi-Fi, of course, but over the Mark II, it now has Bluetooth, and something that I'm very keen to. I like people who watch or listen to this show know that I love geotagging images, and it just works very, very well on the Sony system. It's a little convoluted when you set it up. You have to pair the devices using Bluetooth, the other device, of course, being your smartphone. And then you have to kind of pair it again in the Play Memories app running on your phone itself. And you need to have that app running on the phone. But once it is, it just finds the camera when you switch it on. And when you switch it off, it gracefully disconnects and reconnects again, and uses whatever the location information that the phone has received at that point. So as long as the phone has got a good signal of the GPS satellites, then it will just tag your images without you having to do anything. And that works really, really well. It also helps you power up the camera without worrying about Wi-Fi passwords and stuff, although there's still NFC if you want to use that instead. So I think they've really improved the wireless capabilities of it as well. Again, nothing we hadn't already seen on the A9, but it's really nice to see it here. Doug, did you use the Bluetooth at all?
I did on the A9. I didn't actually try it on that Mark III Alpha 7. But yeah, it's a great new feature, and it changes the way that I do my geotagging.
Now, while we're talking about wireless, people who are familiar with Sony's previous generation cameras will know that they used to do this quite interesting thing in the interface where you actually could download little mini apps into the camera itself to expand its functionality. Sony would get you excited about this by kind of deploying the camera with a really basic smartphone remote control, and then say, hey, you could sign up and download the enhanced version and have full manual control. And once it was in, they would say, well, hey, how about an interval timer? Hey, how about some bulb timers? Hey, how about these other things? It may not have said hey each time, but you get the idea. So the Play Memories apps thing within the camera allowed you to expand its functionality, but it was overly convoluted to set up. Now, on the RX10 Mark IV and the Alpha A9, they removed the Play Memories apps within the camera, which is fine. I don't miss having to sign up for them, and I love that you now get the full remote control functionality with the full manual exposure control. That's great. But what they haven't done on those models is provided any replacement for those apps, for the functionality of those downloadable apps. That things like an interval timer, a feature that is pretty much common on all mid to high end cameras now. They have built-in interval timers, built-in bulb timers. Sony used to deploy that with the downloadable apps. Now it's removed the downloadable apps, but they've forgotten to actually build it into the camera standard. So the RX10 Mark IV didn't have it, the Alpha A9 didn't have it, and now unfortunately the Alpha A7r Mark III doesn't have it either. So if you buy this $3,200 camera or however much it costs, you're not going to have a built-in interval timer. You're not going to have a way to deploy more than 30-second exposures within the camera itself.
There's no bulb mode. We were looking for it the other night. We couldn't find any way to go to bulb mode. You go to the slowest shutter is 30 seconds, and that's it.
Well, there is a bulb in manual. You can do it, but then you need to have a cable release accessory or an intervalometer accessory. There is no, but which is very old-fashioned, because you look at say what Olympus Olympus kind of pioneered this by letting you dial in exposures for say 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes. You could just do that. Then Canon started doing bulb timers where you could say, look, close the shutter after this period of time. Then Fujifilm came out with something really nice on the actually it's been added with a firmware update to some of its other models, but I first saw it on the XE3 where, and this is the most sensible thing, you just keep turning the dial. Why does it arbitrarily stop at 30 or 60 seconds? Well, it doesn't on the Fuji anymore. It just keeps going. You can just keep going beyond 60 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, all the way to 15 minutes. These are great features if you're a long exposure photographer, but they're not on the A7r Mark III. And without the downloadable apps, there's no way to download them. So this is very frustrating to me, and I think this is a big issue for Sony that they need to fix. It's only for a small number of photographers, but if you're one of those photographers, it's frustrating, and it does make you think, hey, I've spent a lot of money on this camera. Why doesn't it do this fairly fundamental thing? So that's the downside to the wireless thing. Sony do need to build in some means by which you can have an interval timer, time-lapse facilities. I'm going to show you later on a way you can do a time-lapse video, but it's still not as broad a functionality as you would find on most of its rivals. Doug, do you think this is a big deal, or do you think I'm just getting my knickers in a twist over something that only affects me?
No, I think, for that class of person who used the downloadable apps in previous versions of the cameras, they're going to miss them. They do already. And there was a whole range of them, from perfectly normal things like intervalometer to some certain special effects and multiple exposures and things like that. If you've been using them, you're going to miss them.
Definitely. So Sony, you need to fix that. And on that minor bombshell, we're going to stop this video and move on to a second part. Now, if you're listening to the podcast, just keep listening. Nothing's going to happen. Just keep listening. It's all going to be fine. If you're watching the video, we're going to stop it here and continue in part 2. So please check that out if you'd like to find out more about the Sony A7r Mark III, or of course, head on over to cameralabs.com for my full in-depth review of that. Hopefully see you on part 2.